Hi, Marie. I'm Tom Vander Ark. I'm an advocate, advisor, and investor in next generation learning. I really devoted um, the last 20 years, particularly the last 10 years, to innovations and learning. I write at gettingsmart.com, and we're pleased that you do too on occasion. And we try to write a blog a day, a paper a month, and a book a year on the path forward. I love the term agency, although not everyone knows what we're talking about. Um, when when I wrote Getting Smart 5 years ago, I said that this digital revolution that we're part of was going to improve customization, motivation, and equalization. That it held the potential that every student could have a customized learning path, and that we'd be able to unlock the real key, student motivation, and that if we did it with equity in mind, that all boats could rise, that we could really not only help struggling students do much better, but that we could blow the top off with kids ready to learn. And I really think agency runs through all three of those. There's been a few schools. I first saw them in Chugach, Alaska in 1999 that were the best of the one-room schoolhouse. These little native villages where one teacher and a group of students, K-12, they built this extraordinary system where every student could move at their own pace. And if you asked any student on any day, what are you learning and why, they could describe it. And then here's the key: they could tell you what they needed to do to move to the next level, how they would learn, and how they would demonstrate. And that was my first experience in a high agency school where students owned their own learning. They understood what they were learning, why it was important, how they were going to learn next, and how they were going to demonstrate. If students have voice and choice in that path forward, that sense of customization, then I think that's a high agency environment. If there are learning experiences that are both intrinsic and extrinsically motivating, I think we can help American kids work much harder. I think the pervasive problem in American schools, particularly at the secondary level, is just boredom. And I think a high agency environment where you ask students to take responsibility for their own learning, and you make them a co-curator of a unique pathway. You and I have both seen enough environments that we know we can unlock motivation and get kids to work much harder because they want to. And then the equalization. A lot of well-supported kids come to school with a sense of efficacy, but a lot of kids from low-income backgrounds where their families are struggling to get by don't have that sense of efficacy, both about being in an adult context or the sense that they should be entitled to own their own learning. And so I think agency is key to equalization, to helping all kids appreciate the fact that they can and should own their own learning. You and I have seen many low agency environments. You could call them high compliance environments. It's really most of American schools. It's most Eastern schools as well. The high performing countries of Korea, Taiwan, slightly less so Singapore these days, but they're generally high compliance schools. And in a high compliance school, there's obvious benefits to a high compliance school. Kids don't screw around. They sit in rows. They behave. They do what you tell them to do. And we know a high compliance school can create relatively high levels of rote learning, where kids can memorize and regurgitate. They learn the rules and they're spoon-fed. But I don't think I've ever seen a high compliance environment that actually promoted deep learning, where kids were really learning at a conceptual level, where they were able to transfer their knowledge to a new area, where they were able to attack an unfamiliar or non-routine problem in a thoughtful and creative way that indicated transferability of knowledge. And these are the most important skills in the world in which we live. And so high compliance creates compliant learners, but it really doesn't create the deep skills that we're looking for today of critical thinking, collaboration, and creativity. I think you have to have a sense of agency in order to create those deeper skills. I like to think about three things, and most people only talk about instruction, but I want to come back to that last. The first thing is culture of agency, and the wonderful thing is that you can gauge a school culture in the first 20 seconds that you're in the building, in the way that you enter the building, what you see and what you hear, and the extent to which it invites you in, and how people greet you, and the relationship that you see exhibited between students and between adults and students can tell you with relatively high precision in the first 20 seconds whether it's a high agency culture or not, whether students are respected as learners, whether they've been given responsibility as learners. And conversely, when you go in most American high schools, you can tell in 20 seconds that they have asked students to be compliant learners, but it's actually students that own the hallway. That there's a student-created culture that isn't about learning, and the adults are just trying to keep the lid on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about giving students responsibility for learning, and that begins with the culture. I visited the Santa Ana schools in California last week. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in Southern California. When you think of Orange County, you think of Newport, but if you go north of the Santa Ana airport, there's a rectangle of 60,000, mostly Hispanic, almost entirely low income, mostly ELL students. But they have the gift of a district leadership that's creating a high agency culture. Part of that is a bring your own device and a bring your own network policy, which suggests that students can bring their own device and they can use their own network, but there's acceptable use policies, and even more importantly, an acceptable use practices, and maybe even more important than that, an acceptable use culture that respects students and says, you're young adults, we want you to bring learning devices to school, but we're going to learn together in a responsible way. And when I visit schools like that, it's apparent that high agency begins with culture. The second thing that people don't think much about is an advisory system. At the secondary level, an advisory system is absolutely critical. It's a matching, a pairing of an adult and a student, hopefully for the entire period of time that a student is at that school. It may be with maybe 20 other students, and an advisory would meet every day in many schools, at least 2 or 3 times a week. And an adult has a chance to build a relationship with a student, to find out who they are as a person and who they are as a learner, and then to become an advocate for that learner. It means that there's at least one person at school every day that cares about whether a student came to school, that checks in to see how they're doing emotionally, socially, and academically. And I think unless you have these powerful, sustained relationships that start with an advisory and then extend into the classroom, you can't really create a high agency experience. The role of the advisor is really to co-curate the learning trajectory at that school. And while they may not be involved in a particular classroom decisions, they are helping students make good decisions about course selection. They play a role in career education, and they play a role in college guidance. My partner, Bonnie Lathram, was an advisor at Big Picture Schools, and Big Picture Learning is really a national network of schools, and it's really the best example of helping students begin to understand who they are as individuals and learners, and then to set goals, weekly goals, and then longer term goals, and then identifying internships aligned with those goals. And that all starts in an advisory. And then finally, the learning program. We've talked about culture, we've talked about advisory, but it really does come down to what happens in the classroom. And a high agency school gives students voice and choice. So that means that students can work at their own pace. It means that to some extent, students have some path flexibility. So that could mean in some schools, students could be learning in very, very different ways. Like Kunskapsskolan is a highly individualized chain in Sweden where students have a lot of latitude over the path. In a project-based school like New Tech Network, a national network of 180 project-based schools, students will have some ability to imprint, to fingerprint the project that they're working on. So they may have a choice over what they study or how they structure a project or a paper. So students have some control over pace, some control over path. I also like to see students presenting, and they'll have some choice over how they present themselves. And along with that, we'd like to see students publishing, so that you're changing the culture from doing work for your teacher to publishing work to a broader audience. We think that is part of shifting to a high agency culture. And then finally, students need a portfolio, a place to capture those presentations and those publications in a collection of personal best. And with their advisor and their teacher, they can cultivate this collection of personal best that then can be shared with potential employers and with post-secondary institutions. And so all of those aspects of co-creating a sequence of learning experiences, and then having the ability to present, to publish, and to portfolio those experiences in a unique way, all create a high agency environment. I just wrote a blog on machine learning. This is probably a topic you know a lot more about than I do. I have started listening to a number of machine learning podcasts, and I particularly enjoyed a podcast about the mastered algorithm. It's a new book by University of Washington professor, and he made this interesting comment that secondary and post-secondary education continue to operate in silos, but increasingly they're all talking to machine learning. So anybody at a university or anybody at a big organization that's working on a big problem is inevitably talking to people in machine learning, because anything with big data that's very complex requires a machine learning solution. So this is a field that basically went from zero to becoming what Pedro Dominguez called the new switchboard for higher education in a period of 20 years. And I think that's really fascinating. education moves more slowly than the corporate sector, but I do think machine learning is an important development. We see good examples of it now in adaptive learning. Products like Dreambox Math and iReady, which is math and reading, Newton, Reasoning Mind, and others are good early examples of the use of a recommendation engine. It's driven by a learner profile, and it recommends or sequences a set of learning experiences for students. And so that customizes the pathway forward. I think what we'll see, we're starting to see this with platforms like Guru Learning. These recommendation engines don't automatically cue things. They'll suggest things for teachers and students, and what it will do is inform the curation of personalized pathways. So the link to this high agency environment is that in addition to being partnered with a caring adult, if you're partnered with a smart algorithm that is informing that dynamic duo, I'm really confident that it's going to become much easier to create really powerful learning trajectories for all students. It'll help to customize the learning environment. One challenge in blended learning is because every kid's doing their own thing, that dynamic scheduling is a total nightmare. And right now people try to do this on spreadsheets or on a whiteboard, but algorithms are going to improve dynamic scheduling. And one of my favorite programs from New Classrooms called Teach to One takes advantage of a predictive algorithm and dynamic scheduling to create small group instruction. So a teacher and a small group of kids are learning a lesson together, but the magic is that every kid has demonstrated readiness for that lesson on that day in that modality. That's the magic we should be creating for kids and teachers, and it's driven by machine learning. And so like every other sector, machine learning is going to be this smart infrastructure layer behind everything that we do, and it in particular is going to inform high agency learning.